All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 30, Political Storms at Home and Abroad, 1968 to 1980. We'll be looking at Section 1, Identity Politics in a Fractured Society. So, last chapter, Chapter 29, we had already talked a little bit about how society in the United States was fracturing in the 1960s. The Vietnam War was a major divisive issue. You had people who were called hawks, that is in favor of the war, versus those who were against the war called the doves. You also had the civil rights movement. Those that were in favor of the civil rights movement, those who were against it in the South in particular, the popularity of George Wallace, the segregationist candidate, goes to show you how the political system was kind of breaking down, the New Left emerging as a new political unit. So there's already been some good evidence here that the United States is becoming more fractured in the 60s and the 1970s. Another indication of that is the rise of identity politics. And the rise of identity politics, or identity politics, is kind of like what it sounds. It's politics, or maybe a political agenda based on one's identity. And what we mean by identity are things like race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So things like, which we mentioned in the previous chapter, like the Black Power movement, or the Chicano movement, or the women's movement. I'm just realizing that you can't see that. Would fall under this category, right? Again, politics or political agendas based off identity groups like, the ones that we talked about previously. We'll talk about a little bit more. But another good, or another sign, you might say, that American society was becoming increasingly fractured was the rise of a counterculture movement. And counterculture, or at least particularly the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, more or less was a rejection of 1950s American culture. And what defined 1950s American culture was things like consumerism, we might say materialism, and maybe something like morality, or like a strict Christian morality. And so the counterculture is about kind of going against a lot of these things and establishing kind of a new system of values that is much different from the generation previously. A hippie is somebody who engages in the counterculture movement. A hippie might engage in things like what they called free love, open sexual relations, experiment with drug use. Those typically would have been against kind of this 1950s Christian morality. Hippies probably also don't have a lot of material goods, kind of wearing the same clothes every day, living in a car. That sort of rejection of materials making you happy was a key part of hippie identity. The kind of the climax, you might say, of this movement, or at least the most visible symbol of the counterculture movement, was the Woodstock Music Festival held in 1969, where tens of thousands of people went to a music festival to listen to, again, non-traditional music, engage in drug use, and kind of, it was a symbol of a lot of what the counterculture had to offer. So this is a music festival, which symbolized counterculture. All right, we might say that. And so you can imagine having kind of this, this tension between a 1950s materialistic Christian morality culture and a 1960s, 1970s sort of free love, drug use, anti-consumer culture. That only added to the fractures in American society. But it was also the rise of other groups, organizations, and movements based off identity. So one of the consequences that the civil rights movement had, the increase in social activism, the aware of one's identity and how it relates to American society, was the rise of other movements like, for example, Native American activism. The American Indian movement was created. This is an organization, I call it a social/political organization for Native Americans. And the 1960s and 1970s were sites of protests for Native Americans in a lot of different areas. The occupation of Alcatraz Island used to be a prison in San Francisco. It was abandoned, and Native American activists claimed that land. It was a symbolic reclaiming of land that was taken from Native Americans by the U.S. government, decades or even 100 years before. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a march on Washington, D.C., and of course, Wounded Knee had been the site of the last Indian resistance in 1890. It was also the site of a massacre for those who resisted the U.S. Army back in the Gilded Age. It was sometimes cited as kind of the last stand for Native American sovereignty inside the United States. And so these protests were a lot more visible. The voices of Native Americans were being echoed much louder than in previous decades, and all of these were sites of protest. Additionally, the emergence of the gay rights movement, political and social movement. Now, there had been organizations which advocated for, the rights and social standing of homosexuals in the United States. The Sexual Freedom League of San Francisco is a good example of this. But really, the beginning of the gay rights movement begins with the Stonewall Inn riots. So this, we might say, is the touching off point of the gay rights movement. The Stonewall Inn was a nightclub / bar which was frequented by homosexual patrons. A lot of these kind of, you might call them like underground establishments. They weren't, they weren't part of the mainstream culture. I mean, in some states in the 1950s and 1960s, homosexuality was illegal. These underground, institutions, or not really institutions, but facilities like bars, nightclubs, restaurants, were sometimes often raided by police, and the police would go in there, harass the local patrons. At the Stonewall Inn, when that occurred, the patrons there fought back, and so that became site of this riot and this sort of fighting back at the Stonewall Inn in New York. I believe in 1969, I might be wrong about the year, is considered by many to be the beginning of the gay rights movement, where it became much more public and kind of rose more into the mainstream, not the mainstream, but into the mainstream of the United States. Gay rights advocates promoted the quote-unquote coming out or the come out movement. This was to be public about one's sexual orientation. The saying was someone was in the closet. That was the saying. It meant that you were either a homosexual man or woman, but that was a secret. You didn't sort of tell anyone for fear of social outcasts, for fear of political consequences, for fear of being fired from your job, whatever the consequences may be. And so the gay rights movement was really advocating this idea of, be true to oneself, be public about one's true sexual identity. There were some achievements that were gained. So, for example, the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, removed homosexuality as a mental disorder. It was considered a mental disorder before the 1970s. And of course, there would be much later, there would be battles that would continue dealing with things like legal status, marriage, service in the military that would go on and on and on into the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s. Now, probably the most, at least the most visible, at least maybe the largest of the identity movements of the 60s and 70s was the women's movement, which had achieved a lot of success in the United States, probably up through the 60s and up through the 70s. But by the 1980s, resistance against the women's movement had kind of stalled it in some ways. In the 70s, some more notable achievements, and of course now refers to the National Organization for Women, which was the premier kind of political and social organization for women's rights in the United States. Other notable achievements: Roe versus Wade. This was a Supreme Court ruling for the right for women to have a safe and legal abortion. Title IX was equality in education. You know, one way that you saw Title IX manifest itself was in the rise of women's collegiate sports. But in other words, institutions of higher education had to spend the same amount of money for men as they did women. But by the late 1970s, the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, a proposed amendment to the Constitution which would make discrimination based off sex illegal, would make that an amendment, ultimately failed. By 1979, not enough states had kind of got on board with this movement, and it expired, and so it didn't become an amendment to the Constitution. And so sometimes we, historically speaking, we might say that, well, once ERA was defeated, that women's movement that emerged from the 60s and the 70s came to a conclusion.